It's Tuesday, October the 25th. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Bim Afolami, Labour MP Rebecca Long-Bailey, Politico's Ailbhe and Christopher Hope of the Daily Telegraph. Today, making history. At Buckingham Palace, Rishi Sunak is appointed the first British Asian Prime Minister.
I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately.
And Liz Truss moves out of Downing Street after only 7 weeks in office.
I believe in Britain. I believe in the British people. And I know that brighter days lie ahead.
The main opposition parties demand a general election.
We've been calling for a general election, not to have another game of musical chairs at the top of the Conservative Party.
And this stark warning from a former Conservative leader.
We can no longer indulge in debates about policy. We've just got to get on with governing.
Well, it's been yet another dramatic morning here in Westminster. At 9 o'clock this morning, Liz Truss, she hosted and headed up her final meeting of Cabinet before making a statement outside 10 Downing Street and then heading to Buckingham Palace to tender her resignation as Prime Minister formally to the King. That was followed fairly swiftly, as is in these cases of transition, of which we've seen quite a lot recently, of the Conservative Party leader, the new Conservative Party leader, Rishi Sunak, travelling to Buckingham Palace for an audience with the King, and before travelling back to Downing Street and going straight up to the lectern outside number 10 and delivering his first speech as Prime Minister. Let's listen to some of it.
I've just been to Buckingham Palace and accepted His Majesty the King's invitation to form a government in his name. It is only right to explain why I am standing here as your new Prime Minister. Right now, our country is facing a profound economic crisis. The aftermath of COVID still lingers. Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets and supply chains the world over. I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Liz Truss. She was not wrong to want to improve growth in this country. It is a noble aim. And I admired her restlessness to create change. But some mistakes were made. Not born of ill will or bad intentions. Quite the opposite, in fact. But mistakes, nonetheless. And I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately. I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come. But you saw me during COVID doing everything I could to protect people and businesses with schemes like furlough. There are always limits, more so now than ever. But I promise you this: I will bring that same compassion to the challenges we face today.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak there in his first speech outside number 10 Downing Street. It was very serious and very sombre in terms of delivery. He was the one who referenced the mistakes that have been made by his predecessor and that he has been elected in part to fix them. Can Rishi Sunak undo the damage of the past month?
I think he can. But it's not just up to him, it's up to the government, it's up to the wider parliamentary party to work with him to do that. And yesterday, Conservative MPs, when we had a meeting with Rishi where he came to address us, I've never, in my long 5 years in Parliament, I've never seen a collection, a meeting like that with people so willing, the Prime Minister, to do well and work with him.
Is that because they're facing political and electoral oblivion, or that's certainly what the polls have been saying? Is that what's focused MPs' minds?
Well, if you go through the month or 7 weeks or whatever that we've just had, and you've got somebody finally in who we think can actually deal with the problems and govern the country properly, then, yeah, I'm sure that there was a real, at least I can speak for myself, there was a real sense of relief that we have somebody who we think is capable of gripping the problems and inspiring a competent team to deal with them.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, can Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, undo the damage of the past 7 weeks?
No, definitely not. He was a member of a government that was responsible for the economic vandalism that we saw over the last few weeks. And
well, he wasn't part of Liz Truss's.
He's a Conservative MP, and he's part of the same government that caused the economic car crash that we saw. And I think it's important to note that yesterday, when he delivered his speech to Conservative MPs in Parliament, he very clearly said that he was ruling out an early election because the party faces the existential threat of losing that election. He's putting his party interests ahead of the interests of the country, and what he should do, if he had any morals now, the country's faced 2 unelected prime ministers in the space of a few months. He should be going for a general election so the people of this country can decide who they want to govern throughout this crisis.
Can Rishi Sunak undo the damage of the past 7 weeks? He wasn't part of Liz Truss's government. He obviously was under Boris Johnson before, of course, he resigned in order to see Boris Johnson go.
Well, I think probably he earns a little bit of a premium in terms of not panicking the markets quite so much. The cost of borrowing under his leadership, when you look at the way the markets have gone in recent days, as it's become clearer he'll be Prime Minister, that cost has gone down. The estimates are that will sort of save the Treasury about $7 billion compared to the way they were soaring under Liz Truss. So I suppose in that sense, just by having a leader who reassures things, he's clawed back a little bit of stability. But I think that just the thing that fascinates me as a political journalist is once a party's had a taste from mutiny, how you put that back in the box. You know, Becky knows from her own, you know, from the turmoil in the Labour Party over the past few years. I've just been really struck by how mutinous it has been over the past few weeks. The complete lack of discipline under Liz Truss. And, you know, Bim talking there about this show of unity when Rishi Sunak addressed his colleagues. The interesting thing was the people who didn't go to that. And we were, I think, both at the 1922 committee announcement of the leadership contest result. And I was just looking at the faces of Boris Johnson supporters who didn't clap, didn't smile. I think that there is a sense that they need to pull together to save their seats. But once people have had this taste for mutiny, I don't know if they can pull together again.
Well, that is interesting, isn't it? I mean, listening to what both Bim and Ailbhe are saying in terms of whether or not the Conservative Party is now ungovernable, although they will all be looking through the lens of the next general election. Can he undo the damage of the past 7 weeks? Will he be allowed to do it?
I think so. Right now, there's a huge lot of goodwill for him. I mean, I've been sitting in my place in Portcullis House, and the MPs, they're fooling themselves to come and tell me how pleased they are. One told me that their party had looked into the grave and decided to live. And it's this kind of, forget all the kind of ideology, they are going to survive this. I think Sunak is quite a defensive leader. He shores up the base. They're facing wipeout to Labour an election now, and they think, well, Rishi Sunak will secure the base. Where is he on levelling up? Don't know. I thought it was interesting to hear him say in that speech to mention the manifesto. That's a way of avoiding an election. He mentions the manifesto. If he roots his policies in the manifesto, there's no need to go to the country like Labour want.
But just on that, it's not really about that. It's about uniting the party. You know, the 2019...
They all fought on, yeah.
Yeah, we all fought on that manifesto. It was a popular manifesto, and it was well constructed for the country, and that's why he won a big majority. I think that's the core reason why he's referencing the manifesto and really saying to all of us, look, we were elected to do something, notwithstanding the last few weeks. we're still going to be
But the
committed
problem
to
with
all of those
fracking-
things, and we're going to do it.
But
Well, we're going to find out the substance, of course, because things have changed rather dramatically. We've had Liz Truss, we've had Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor. We've yet to find out if Rishi Sunak will keep him as Chancellor, reversing much of the mini-budget, or certainly one side of it, when it comes to the tax cuts that were announced by the former Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. Well, let's find out from Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. She's in Central Lobby in Parliament. First of all, Vicky Young, just your reflections on what Rishi Sunak said. We've been discussing it here in the studio. He says he's been brought in part to fix the problems of his predecessor, but also, yes, paying tribute to both Liz Truss and Boris Johnson and that mandate that was won, he said, not just by one individual, but collectively in 2019.
Yeah, I mean, of course, he has to pay tribute to his predecessors. You'd expect that. I mean, I think in terms of image, actually, him standing on the steps there for the photographers and the cameras and not a smile on his face. This is him saying, I'm a serious person for very serious times. And I just spoke to a couple of former ministers here who said, look, he pressed all the right buttons with that speech. He offered a little bit of humility, saying really to the public, look, lots of you don't know much about me, but I am up to this job. I think I can do it, but I know I've got to work on that. I've got to work on trust. Talking about his own record, of course, during COVID, saying how he helped steer people through that with the furlough scheme, being honest about the mistakes that were made by his predecessors. And as you say, very interesting there on that issue of the mandate, something that's going to be thrown at the government for a long time by the opposition parties, saying the mandate was for the party. The mandate is for every single Conservative MP that was elected, and him saying that he is willing to take that forward and deliver at least parts, I presume, of the manifesto.
It's going to be difficult to know the direction of the party because so much has changed. There's been so much turmoil over the last few months. But I presume we'll get an indication of that when we find out who is actually going to be serving under Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in those key posts.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, after he gets his briefings in number 10, you'd think that's going to be the first thing that he starts to do. Now, I've been talking to lots of people around here in the last couple of hours, and it is very striking how even those really very close to Rishi Sunak, who spent a lot of time with him in the last few weeks, they're all saying they really don't know what he's going to do. Hermetically sealed is how one of his friends described the whole process. I'm standing very next to someone who might think they could be the next Scottish Secretary. He says to me he has no idea. They don't even know who the Chief Whip is. They think it might be Mel Stride. But there's a list of names of people who have been very loyal to Rishi Sunak. Dominic Raab, Oliver Dowden, Robert Jenrick. Now, of course, they're all men, so there's going to be a lot of eyes on what he's going to do about senior posts for women. I'm told that Penny Mordaunt wasn't even offered a specific role. So at the moment, there's a lot of speculation, which, as you know, Joe, we do like doing. I can't tell you that much of it's that informed.
Well, it's always informed coming from you, Vicky, there at Central Lobby. But come back to us if you hear anything. And, of course, we will announce it immediately on the programme if we hear people have been announced in post. Let's go back just a moment before we talk about the priorities and wait, perhaps, for the first announcements to be made about how big a moment this is. Because Rishi Sunak is the youngest person to be Prime Minister in about 200 years. He's the first non-white Prime Minister, a British Asian. How big a moment is that for you, Bim?
Well, look, I'm obviously not a white MP, so and Conservative. I think it's just brilliant, and it is something that, interestingly, is being covered internationally very differently to how it's being covered in the British press. Whereas, of course, people are quite used to Rishi. We've seen him as Chancellor. We've seen so that I think that's sort of an interesting point of difference. But what I would say is that the focus, and knowing Rishi, reasonably well and having spent a lot of time with him, that is not a conversation, for example, I've particularly had with him. We have talked about lots of different things, but this aspect isn't one. I don't think it's the core to why he's leader. He's leader because we know he's the right guy for the job, and everything else is secondary.
Well, as you say, it's being talked about very much on the international stage, as you would expect. But here, this headline in The Times, Rishi Sunak's Hindu temple hails Britain's Obama moment. Do you think it's an Obama moment, Ailbhe?
Good question. I mean, I think it's really significant and nice for the British Hindu community that he was announced as the next Prime Minister on Diwali. I think that's meant a lot to people, sort of, a fresh start and light. The parallels write themselves. I suppose people can make their own minds up about sort of the wider significance. I think for British Asians all around the UK, especially younger ones, it's nice to have a role model like that. But also people like Rishi Sunak's own family, the people who you know moved over here generations ago, to see you know his own grandparents who moved over to England. Didn't know what kind of a life they were going to have. To see their grandson do so well, that'll be such a proud moment for them and for so many people with stories like that.
I mean, how big a moment is it for you, Rebecca Long-Bailey, or is it that we've seen quite a lot in terms of handovers of power, that we're becoming slightly fatigued?
It's a hugely significant moment, and I don't think it should be underestimated, but unfortunately that's where the good news ends, because now all of our focus turns to what Rishi believes in and what he's actually going to do. He's not outlined any pledges as part of this leadership campaign, but what we do know, I mean, he made reference to honouring his levelling up policies in the 2019 manifesto. Only a few months ago, he was filmed talking to the Tunbridge Wells Conservative Association, boasting about moving money from deprived urban areas into wealthier, more affluent areas. Now, that is not levelling up, and that's not honouring a 2019 election pledge. And if that's the direction of travel he's going to take the country in, then people are quite right to feel angry, and feel angry that they don't have the opportunity to hold a general election to decide themselves whether they want him to be the Prime Minister.
Just on those 2 points, this is really important. The first is on general election, the constitutional position is very clear. This Parliament still has 2 and a bit years to run, and, you know, there is no need for an early election. On the question...
You just don't want an election because you're going to lose significantly. So you can make all the arguments you like about it, but the fact is, it's morally right to hold a general election. We've changed Prime Minister twice in the space of a few months. That hasn't not happened for generations, if it's ever happened at all.
It has happened before.
And I think it's only right to let the public have their say.
Well, I explained the constitutional position. In relation to this comment Rishi made at Tunbridge Wells, what he actually said was that you have poor areas, you have poor parts of rural areas that deserve just as much attention and focus as poor parts of urban areas. And that is something that really matters to me as a constituency MP that is relatively rural, and matters a lot to lots of people. And I think that it's really important.
That's a bit of clever spin there.
It's not clever.
My constituents in Salford have seen their local authorities' budget stripped of millions of pounds, and they're suffering, and it's all as a result of Rishi Sunak and the decisions that he's made.
Rebecca, it's perfectly reasonable to have an argument about local government funding and whether we should have funded councils more. That's a perfectly reasonable argument, but that's not the same thing as saying that rural areas that have pockets of poverty, which are there in rural counties that people think are very wealthy, there are poor parts of it, and part of levelling up is actually to say, this isn't about north and south, east and west, it's about saying wherever there is opportunity, wherever there is talent but there is not opportunity, we're going to spread that. And that is a core Conservative message.
No, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree that there are poorer areas in more rural areas, and of course they deserve more funding. But what you've just outlined is pure spin. Pure spin.
No?
Right. Well, but in terms of priorities and levelling up in those terms, if we are talking about redistributing wealth, these are the things that people will want to know. Why couldn't you call a general election? Fixed-term Parliaments Act has gone. Why not have one?
Because we are in a very difficult economic situation. The immediate focus of everybody in government is going to have to be on stabilising and then improving that situation. And the idea that now you spend all your time electioneering for 3 months before a general election, I'd be on this programme in a couple of months, you'd be saying, God, Bim, you said the economic crisis was so terrible and yet you're electioneering and you're not thinking about the people. Yeah, you've just got to focus on the job in hand. And as we saw from Rishi, the Prime Minister announcing on Downing Street, you know, he is intensely focused on the job in hand.
Right, but it's not just people and opposition parties calling for a general election. Fuming Tory members in the Daily Telegraph threatened to leave after being denied leader vote. The chairman of a Conservative think tank said the decision to bar members was a terrible advert for the party. So we have the opposition parties calling for a general election and Tory party members threatening to leave.
There was a problem with a mandate for this new Prime Minister because he was literally appointed by MPs. I mean, appointed, not even elected, appointed by MPs. And his first words were, the cameras were told, get out, he'll now talk to us, thanks. And we are yet ready to hear him, apart from the speech on outside 10 Downing Street. And I know of our members resigning today because they don't think he's Conservative enough. He's blamed for knifing Boris Johnson in a Shakespearean fashion, and he's seen to be someone who happily put up national insurance increase to pay for health spending, which was then pulled back by the Truss government. He's not trusted yet, and he's got to win over that trust amongst members, Telegraph readers to some degree.
Is there a problem with the mandate here?
Well, I think it was John Major who said that before he won a general election of his own, he felt like he was living in sin with the electorate. And I think whatever Conservative MPs say, I think there is a degree of discomfort with it, especially because the polling does really strongly indicate that that members of the public really do want a general election. I think the point does stand that actually in a general election, I think that's the last thing the journalists would want traipsing around the country. And actually, we've had essentially a zombie government since Boris Johnson announced that he was going to resign. People would like a functioning government, but clearly all the polling is there that most members of the public just want a say in this.
But isn't it the case, as Bim has set out, Rebecca, that actually what people really want is some stability? What they would like to see is some stabilising of the markets. And as a former Chancellor, he'll be able to do that.
I agree that we need stability, but I think given that we've got what could be quite a major budget on the 31st of October, the new Prime Minister and his Chancellor, if it's likely to be Jeremy Hunt still, are going to make some significant political choices.
Which we're going to talk about.
And there are decisions that need to be made to stabilise the economy, and there are decisions that need to be made to make sure that people have enough money to actually live on, to pay their mortgages, to pay their rent, to afford to buy food and heat their homes. And the worry is that they will veer down a path which can only be described as austerity 2.0, when what they should be doing is shoring up the economy for the long term, investing in the drivers of productivity and growth, not cutting off the oxygen supply at a time when we need it most.
We're going to talk about those priorities in just a moment. But first of all, back in July, Jacob Rees-Mogg, he is the business secretary as we sit here at this moment, maybe not for much longer, but he called Rishi Sunak a socialist and said he'd refuse to serve in his cabinet. Do you think he'd change his mind now, Bim?
I don't know, and I don't speak for Jacob. I don't think anyone else does, but I think that was wrong. It was plainly inaccurate, and I suspect he wouldn't say that today. I think even, Jacob, who I spoke to yesterday, is very keen. He's been telling lots of people, we need to unite behind this Prime Minister. We all need to get together. So I think he's probably changed his mind since that time.
All right, well, let's have a look at some of the eye-watering decisions that Jeremy Hunt has talked about as Chancellor. Again, we don't know if he will continue as Chancellor or whether or not we will definitely have that statement next Monday. You heard Rebecca say we're entering a period of austerity. We are, aren't we?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. What I would say is the Prime Minister was clear. Mistakes were made that have put us into a poorer economic position than would have necessarily need to be the case.
Right.
We need to fix those, but that does not mean sort of, 5 years of cutting budgets. What that means is a look at the situation to stabilise the situation and a path upwards and outwards that means that people can see that things are going to get better. And I know Jeremy Hunt, if it is Jeremy Hunt and the Prime Minister, will work very hard on both the short term and the longer term. Because I think that is the thing that people will need to see is, OK, it's going to be tough this year, but is it going to be tough the year after that?
Right, so you're admitting there will be a squeeze on public spending for the next couple of years at the very least?
Well, I said it will be tough. I don't know what's in the statement on Monday, but it is clear that there are, there is a fiscal.
There's a 30 to 40 billion. There's a 30 to 40 billion pound black hole a year. We know from most of the observations being made.
And there are different ways of dealing with that.
Right. Well, so which way should it be dealt with?
I mean, it's just
spending cuts or tax rises.
Well, as you know, it's a mixture of different things. It also depends.
All
of
them.
The thing that Ailbhe was saying earlier on. The fact that Rishi is now Prime Minister, that fact alone and the credibility he has reduced the cost of government borrowing significantly to the tune of many billions.
But it's not going to fill that black hole.
But what I'm saying is there are a lot of moving parts here, and those moving parts are all going to have to be analysed and looked together. And the Prime Minister is probably the person in Parliament on both sides of the House with the best understanding of markets and the financial economy. So
all right, well,
he's the best guy to look at it.
All right, well, we'll come back to you in a moment about specifically which cuts. The Independent, this is you, Rebecca Long-Bailey. Britain won't accept Jeremy Hunt's new age of austerity. But if Labour were to win an election, they would be inheriting this. I know you wouldn't start from here, but you would be inheriting the figures, something like £100 billion worth of borrowing. As I said, a 30 to 40 billion pound a year black hole. What decisions would you make to balance the books. What would Keir Starmer do?
Well, firstly, I think it's breathtaking that the government, in the guise of Jeremy Hunt or whoever the new Chancellor might be, are undertaking a round of austerity on the British public as a result of the economic vandalism that this government caused. Now, on the issue of austerity itself, I think it's important to take a step back, first of all, and the point that I was making in my article is that people understand now what austerity meant the first time round. They knew the economic ramifications. They saw what it did to their public services, which are now on the brink. There's nothing left to cut in public services.
Although I have to remind viewers that Labour were proposing quite similar things and action to be taken after the financial crash and during the years of the coalition.
And we now know that they weren't the right decisions. What happened in terms of austerity? So public services were cut to the bone, lives were destroyed. We went into a double-dip recession. And we saw the worst productivity level since the 18th century. We didn't drive up growth. Austerity starved the economy of the drivers of productivity. What we need to see, and this is something that the Labour Party certainly advocated, in terms of costing in detail, of course, we'll have to wait and see how Rachel Reeves responds to the budget announcement next week. But we want to invest in infrastructure, research and development, a Green New Deal, skills, to boost the economy and incentivise more
And would
growth.
you borrow to fund all of that, or would you increase taxes?
So there's two ways to approach this. So in terms
you borrow or you increase taxes?
No, there's two ways. So you've got your day-to-day spending, which is what you spend on public services. Now, most governments, if not all governments, should promise to ensure that all of their taxes will cover their day-to-day spend. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and that's why we've got a deficit. Now, in terms of borrowing, that should be used to invest wisely on things that will produce a return for the government.
Yeah, but is it going to return? Is it going to return 30 to 40 billion pounds a year? That's what people will be asking. You don't want to see departments have their spending cut.
That's right.
Is that what you will preside over? I mean, for example, the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson has said, I can't see the government cutting the health service. The next is pensions. Well, there's been a commitment, from Prime Minister Liz Truss, that you're going to keep the triple lock. Working age welfare, should that be uprated in line with inflation benefits?
Well, it is. All of these things need to be taken in the round.
Yeah, but what do you think, Bim Afolami? These are about choices.
Well, they are about choices, but you've outlined some. There are others, and there'll be some that we're all unaware of as well. My personal view on a couple of those things you mentioned, in relation to pensions going up with inflation, I understand why that is desirable, and if it were up to me, we should try and achieve that. It is also, I think, important to look at potentially other things that maybe pensions don't necessarily go up at that rate for a year or so. Why? Because you've got a situation around working age people. So you've got to make sure that whatever you're doing on the working age side, you've got to try and balance off against the pension side. So I'm not saying you should do one or the other, but I'm saying that we shouldn't allow a growing inequity between people who are working and people who are pensioners. That's one area where we need to look. In relation to the health service, no, I don't think it's wise to reduce spending on the health service, but we can definitely improve the way in which we spend some of that money. And I think that looking at ways in which we do that, again, so really we've got to try and take things in the round. I don't think we should say, right, we should just have one sacred cow and everything else gets cut a lot. I think we should try and overall reduce...
Are there any sacred cows? What about defence spending? There has been a commitment for 3% of national income to be spent on defence. Rishi Sunak didn't commit to that.
So it's really easy to come and say, look, we should spend 3% on defence. The reason why I don't agree with that is I don't think you should ever fix to any particular percentage. What we should say is we will spend what is necessary according to the reviews that were done, whether it be by Number 10 or the MOD or whoever, or independent reviews as to what we need to keep the country safe. And if that's 3%, it should be 3%. But if it's less than that, or it's more than that, then we should also consider that as well. I don't think we should fix ourselves.
I think it's all about making the right political choices. We're trying to find...
But what are the right political choices?
One example then, so certainly something that I doubt Rishi Sunak will look at, but increasing the windfall tax on oil and gas companies who are making super profits at the moment, making sure that income from wealth is taxed at the same rate as income from work. That would be a starting point to increase the tax receipts that we currently receive. Then broader than that, we need to have a fairer taxation system that taxes wealth in a fairer way. We don't have that system at the moment. Then alongside that, you grow your tax base, and that's where investment in productivity comes in.
Higher taxes for more people. That is what you're saying.
Well, for oil and gas companies, certainly.
Well, we know at the moment that it would raise about £8.1 billion. You could do a further windfall tax. It might raise up to £20 billion. there are still tens of billions of pounds that would have to be made up. Wealth taxes. Tell us about the wealth taxes that you would be in favour of.
Well, there's a whole permutation of wealth taxes out there, and I wouldn't like to pin my hopes on one particular one. I think that's a discussion that the country needs to have. But certainly, it's a position that's even advocated by millionaires. There's a group called Patriotic Millionaires who are advocating for a tax on wealth. Not extreme taxes, but just to make the taxation system fairer, because it can't be right when somebody who works pays more in tax than someone who's gaining their income from wealth.
Well, and that is maybe a debate that needs to be had. I haven't heard it yet from Keir Starmer, though, in terms of wealth taxes or in terms of broadening the base in that sense, in the way that Rebecca is outlining in order to increase receipts.
I mean, I think it's fascinating because obviously this is a huge challenge for the Conservatives. They're going to have to make very unpopular decisions. Things like pensions that we just heard will be really hard to sell with the Conservative Parliamentary Party. But on the Labour side, it's really difficult too. You know, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, their priority has been since they came into office or since they took over the leadership, their priority has been to shore up their economic credibility. The Labour Party doesn't win when it loses to the Conservatives on economic credibility, and they're ahead at the moment. So all of their messaging, as you've probably noticed, every time they're on the airwaves, they talk about things being fully costed, sticking to their fiscal rules and so on. But it means that then all these things that they actually want to do are much harder to promise. And then Rebecca Long-Bailey, from a little bit of a different tradition within the Labour Party, is making bolder calls for more radical things. And I think that it means that maybe Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves feel a little bit squeezed into a corner. How can they present their optimistic vision, all the things they want to do, when the thing they're trying to knock people over the heads with every time they watch TV is that they can be trusted with the economy, which is something Labour really struggles with.
I mean, how is Rishi Sunak going to keep Conservative MPs on board? I mean, the honeymoon period, if you can call it that, blithely, may not last very long at all. I mean, they were mutinous over the 45p tax rate policy. Pressure was put on Liz Truss, so she announced keeping the triple lock for pensions, uprating them in line with inflation. Aren't they going to do the same the minute there is an announcement that they don't like?
Well, it starts with a reshuffle this afternoon. Will there be enough right-wingers, Brexiteers, put at the high command of the Tory government? The Brexiteers are not sure about Rishi Sunak after his behaviour over the Northern Ireland Protocol in June, when he tried to water down this Northern Ireland Protocol bill with Michael Gove, and that was fought by Liz Truss and others in the cabinet. There are big issues, I think, here. I mean, at the moment, on tax be a good starting point. Remember, I think Labour's still in charge of still in favour of cutting the base rate to 19p. I think that's right. Whereas the Tories have axed that. I mean, at the moment, policy is want your taxes cut, vote Labour, which is not where the Tories need to be at all.
Would you like to see Keir Starmer be more radical?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about being radical, it's about doing the sensible things that will grow the economy and improve living standards. And that means having a long-term economic vision. I hate using that term, but that's the truth. And you need to have fiscal rules to prove to the markets and to the country that you're going to be responsible. But you can't grow the economy without investing in infrastructure, in Green New Deals, in skills, in jobs, in the new technologies of the future. And that's why we need to grow the economy at the same time as making sure that we have that fair taxation system.
So I think it's important for me to say, I agree with a lot of what Rebecca said. It is important to have a longer-term economic vision. And I think that the challenge for the Conservative Party as we come into the coming weeks is, yes, we are going to have to make difficult decisions. We've had a very sort of difficult debate about different choices. But this is over the medium, longer term. This is how we're proposing to grow the economy. And actually, that is a challenge for us. And we have to show people that we have a vision to do that is actionable, deliverable, and has a broad spread of support.
Right, some news just in. Jacob Rees-Mogg, whom we were talking about earlier, the now former business secretary, has resigned. He's gone. We don't know yet who will replace him. We haven't heard yet about any of the key positions. Someone else who resigned or was forced to resign very recently was the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, over differences on policy and direction of travel for the Conservative Party and the government, one of them over immigration. You talk about growth. Would you like to see higher levels of immigration, more relaxation of those restrictions in order to boost growth, as some people in your party think is necessary?
Well, for the right sort of immigration, I would agree. And when I say the right sort, what do I mean? I mean finding talented people in areas where we have skill shortages. And that, by the way, is not just high paid. We have skill shortages in some low paid areas as well, which will help grow our economy. But what we don't need to see are lots of people coming who don't necessarily have particular skills they're bringing, who aren't necessarily going to help grow the economy.
Right.
So that's how...
But you'd be in favour of a relaxation?
Well, no, listen to what I said. It was not a wholesale relaxation. I'm saying in areas where we need the right people with the right skills, whether that be for public services or whatever, or people who we know can help grow the economy, that's the sort of immigration from wherever in the world, not just from Europe, but from all countries in the world. That's what we should be prioritising. And yes, if that means having more people who come here to be doctors or more people who come here to be entrepreneurs, then I'm all for it.
And you support that too, Rebecca Long-Bailey?
Well, certainly. I think Yvette Cooper set out a strategy whereby she plans to consult with employers and trade unions about how we encourage that skills migration into the country to fill the gaps that we currently have at the moment. But ultimately, we've got a government who doesn't respect the dignity of immigrants who come to this country.
Really?
And you've got the hostile environment, the Windrush scandal, the Immigration and Borders Bill. That treats people with disdain, absolute disdain. They're not treated like human beings by this government.
I'll be very serious about this. We have got, as we mentioned earlier, the first ethnic minority Prime Minister whose father's a doctor, mum's a pharmacist. Both from this country. I speak as somebody. Whose father's a doctor, whose mum's a pharmacist. You know, we have lots of people in the Conservative Party whose parents come from similar backgrounds, and so the idea that we do not regard those people with dignity really irritates me.
Your policies are not treating them with dignity. Do you agree with the Rwanda policy, sending people to a country miles away? Do you agree with the Immigration and Borders Bill that forces refugees to take unsafe routes so that they put their lives at risk? Do you agree?
It is right. As I said about what sort of immigration I think we should have, it is also right that we need to have secure borders, and we don't have people coming to this country through safe countries who are coming illegally. That is not a good outcome. What we should have are people who come legally, particularly where they have areas of skills that we need. I think that's a perfectly reasonable, balanced approach.
The legislation is forcing people to take illegal routes. It's making the problem far worse.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, let me interject. First of all, I mean, Rishi Sunak is committed to the policy, to the Rwanda policy. Should he be?
It's a policy that's got widespread support across the...
Does it have your support?
Well, it's part of a wider... Yes, insofar as it's part of a wider package of measures, but it's wrong to say, and if some people in my party think this is true, I think they're wrong, it's wrong to say that this policy itself solves all our problems around illegal immigration. Of course it doesn't. There's a whole bunch of things that we need to do, of which that is part, but there are legal changes that are required. There's improved relationships with France that are also required in order to get this right. So it is part of a wider discussion that we need to have about how we get safer borders to stop illegal immigration, but at the same time, when we want high-skilled people to come to this country to do jobs that we need, getting them as well. How
big an issue is immigration going to be? It has been a big issue in the past. Rishi Sunak does seem committed to the policies undertaken by Priti Patel and Suella Braverman. He's a Brexiteer, so clearly concerned about, as the slogan went, taking back control, even if it hasn't worked in the way some people felt it should. How much of an issue is it going to be?
It's a big deal. I mean, 200,000 a year net migrants coming in since Brexit is a lot. It's a third down from pre-Brexit levels, but still a lot for a lot of people. That's not the control people who thought they're going to get. And certainly look at the small boats coming across the Channel. I mean, just look at what Nigel Farage is saying. And he is the kind of, when he starts chirping away on the Twitter, there's a problem for the Tory party. I think that's one that need to grip it. The battle with Suella Braverman was about whether you relax immigration to boost economic growth, to sort out the OBR forecasts coming out next Monday. So that's the complete contrast. But it's about controlling immigration for a lot of Tories, but equally seeing to be controlling it and feeding it into the right places in the economy.
I mean, Ailbhe, the whole issue of immigration, it looks as if now people are seeing higher levels of immigration as a way of boosting growth.
Yeah, and we know that that's why Suella Braverman and Liz Truss were at loggerheads before she handed in her resignation. It wasn't just that she broke some rules around security measures. It was actually that bigger disagreement because she was coming under pressure to put immigration targets up a bit, which would improve growth, because they were in that very difficult economic situation, needed to be showing to the markets that they were going to fill that black hole. That problem hasn't really gone away for Rishi Sunak, even though Suella Braverman, we don't know if she's going to be Home Secretary, and she's maybe on balance less likely to be.
Well, she was found to have breached the ministerial code, of course, as well.
No, but even, you know, if she were to be brought back out or, you know, given another cabinet position, I think you know, Rishi Sunak is trying to bring all parts of the party together. That's just one of so many issues. You know, triple lock on pensions, the aid budget, defence budget. There are actually so many things that are such a hard sell to that party, and they all know they need to get behind it. But I mean, I wouldn't envy Rishi Sunak making those choices right now.
And let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph about the sort of leader Rishi Sunak may be, or his style, because as we heard and saw at the beginning of the programme, he looked very serious, and he said he's got to fix some very big economic problems. Now in survival mode, the Tories have put competence over charisma with Rishi Sunak. The government has rejected the passions of Brexit for the demands of the market, but Boris, well, let's leave that for the moment, will be back someday. Do you agree with that, that actually this is Rishi Sunak in serious mode? He doesn't have the boosterism of Boris Johnson. He's not the ideologue in the way Liz Truss was. What sort of leader will he be?
Well, no, he isn't like Boris Johnson or like Liz Truss in the ways you describe. He is sort of what you see on the tin. What's bizarre is often that a lot of commentary will be about, oh, well, is someone really going to do this? Or are they really going to do that? And the advice I always give to people is just watch them and listen to them. And generally speaking, what you saw with the Prime Minister as he made his announcement is what he's like. He's a serious guy. He works incredibly hard. He's very focused on the issue at hand. And that's how he'll approach his premiership. Now, for some people, they'll say, no, I want a bit more, you know, ideology. Or some people, they may say, I want more razzmatazz or boosterism. I'm doubtful that that's what the country really wants at the moment. I don't think it's necessarily what the Conservative Party wants. What we want is to deal with the problems of the country and to do them in a competent way.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a safe bet. He's defensive for the Tories. I wonder when Labour might start exploiting his wealth, which is a lot, and how he can really feel the pain of voters in a cost-of-living election.
I mean, I think what's striking, though, is, I mean, we're talking about competence, but he is not a very experienced politician. Just literally,
I mean, he won a seat in 2015.
Yeah, he's very new to Parliament, a bit like Keir Starmer. When we now have in the leaderships of both parties, these people who were very successful in their previous careers, who've come into politics at the helms of their parties, but don't necessarily know the game of politics. We did see that a little bit as Chancellor. Rishi Sunak did make some missteps. And I think, you know, now he's in the top job, that lack of experience could come back to haunt him.
Do you think the electorate wants a more, let's put it this way, boring style of politics for the moment? Perhaps both from Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer?
Well, I love boring politicians and managerial ones, but it's in whose interests they're managing the country is the question. And if Rishi Sunak turns out to be a manager managing the interests of the very wealthy, as Liz Truss was trying to do, then that's not going to go down well with the British public. They've had enough of this now. They want to have a general election and they want Rishi Sunak to be honest about what he plans for the country.
I mean, what do you want me to say? I mean, look, I'm
not going to put words into your mouth, Bim.
You never do, you never do. Look, it is clear that we have somebody at the helm who understands particularly the economic problems incredibly well. And as a starter, that is a really, really significant for them.
But he isn't very experienced, is he, as Ailbhe said?
Well,
he came in 2015. He was parachuted in to be Chancellor at a very young age after Sajid Javid resigned. And then COVID happened. And he did deal with a situation where he was allowed to be very generous because there was probably no other option in terms of furlough. He's untested, really, isn't he?
Well, look, as a young politician who came in a couple of years after Rishi, I think there's nothing against young politicians.
Are you expecting a call? Are you expecting a call from Rishi Sunak, by the way?
There's nothing, well, not to be Chancellor, you know, I think Jeremy... No, look, there's nothing against young politicians. I actually think the experience outside politics is relevant. It's not completely irrelevant, particularly his experience in financial markets and business, which I think is significant. But this isn't just about the Prime Minister. And I know it's fashionable these days to just talk about the person at the top, but this is about a wider government. It'll be about a wider parliamentary party. And all of us together are going to have to try and pull together and govern the country effectively. That's all we have time for after another pretty dramatic morning and few hours here in Westminster, introducing Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. It'll be his first Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow, where he'll face Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition. From all of us here, bye-bye.